Hello, everyone. On behalf of Turning Point USA at Eastern Michigan University, I wanted to thank you all for coming. Turning Point USA at EMU is committed to promoting freedoms, free speech, and limited government. We are excited to introduce our speaker, Ian Haworth. As a political commentator, podcast host, and writer, Ian Haworth provides honest, principled, and hard-hitting conservative insight. Without further ado, Ian Haworth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight. Before we start, I'd like to thank Emily for inviting me to speak to you, and also thank Turning Point USA for hosting this event. Unfortunately, because 2020 is officially the weirdest year of all time, I can't be there in Michigan to speak to you in person, but it's still an honor to join you all via Zoom instead. Since this is a Zoom call, I hope we've all learned from CNN's Jeffrey Toobin and are either wearing pants or remember to check that the camera is off before any of us decide to take a break. In Alan Bennett's The History Boys, Hector, an eccentric teacher who is one of the story's central characters, declares to his students that I would hate to turn out boys who, in later life, would claim to have a love of literature or speak of the lure of language and their love of words. Words said in a way that's somehow Welsh. In an act of reliable ignorance, the school's neurotic headmaster, Felix, gives the following, now this is a spoiler alert, eulogy for Hector at the end of the play. If I speak of Hector, it is of enthusiasm shared, passion conveyed, and seed sown a future harvest. He loved language. He loved words. Now, few of us actually love words, whether it be the way Hector or Felix viewed that term. Quite frankly, in order for our society to function and for the ideologies we value to continue, we don't need to have a broad love of words if we don't wish to. However, if we want to protect our civilization and promote the ideology of conservatism or even traditional Western liberalism, we must all have an understanding for words. It doesn't matter whether we love words or not, but it does matter that we know what they mean, and it is this meaning of words which I want to discuss tonight. Make no mistake, the meaning of words, and our language more generally, is under attack as part of the left's desire for power and influence, and we must play a part in defeating the war that is waging on words and their meaning. On a simple level, what are words? Words are the fundamental building blocks we use to communicate with one another. Sounds we hear and shapes we see, which describe ideas and actions. A wide variety of animals have their own means of communication, and humans have developed an intricate and detailed method of forming the abstract flickers of thought in our head into these sounds and shapes which others can, hopefully, understand. However, for such a system to work, we have to be on the same page. In the same way as a game where one team is playing football and another team is playing basketball would end in misery and chaos, we must all follow a set of rules before our system of communication can have any hope of working. This is true for animals and has been true for all human history. Think back to our caveman days, which often don't seem that far in the past, and even then, we use sounds, signs, and shapes to communicate with one another. With even the most basic ability to communicate, we could express feelings of love, ask for something to eat, or warn one another that a wolf had just wandered into our cave. But what happens if we don't have the same understanding of what words mean? For example, it wouldn't be much use if the set of caveman grunts for I love you was the same as the caveman grunts for I'm a bear. We wouldn't have lasted very long as a species if every time a caveman expressed love for his wife on Caveman Valentine's Day, his wife proceeded to beat him to death with a rock. While far more complex, the same is true today. Every language, including our own, requires an objective platform of meaning. Language is meaningless if we can't agree on what our tools of language, namely words, mean. When I say tree, we all know that I'm talking about a tree. When I say Michigan, we all know I'm talking about a state. When Nancy Pelosi shuffles into her kitchen and asks one of her servants for her morning vodka, her staff know to give her vodka, not gin. Unfortunately, the left are deliberately trying to destroy this very system of objective meaning in order to hijack the ability to control and police language in order to achieve their goals. I'm going to explain what their strategies look like, why we must fight back, and finally, how we can fight back. The left's war on language seems like it was taken straight from the pages of George Orwell's 1984, with two excerpts being depressingly relevant. The first is, don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. The second is more succinct. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. While part of the left's goal is indeed to actively criminalize certain speech, for example, making the utterance of something defined as hate speech a criminal offense, I want to focus on the more subtle and more dangerous parts of their strategy, which include the basic definition of words, the use of meaningless tautologies or empty slogans to dilute complex issues, and the use of lazy virtue signaling to force us to choose between their version of good and their version of bad. The first part of the left's strategy to usurp our language is the easiest to spot, and also the most effective over time. It involves the redefinition of our language, specifically parts of our language or the meaning of words which are politically inconvenient. The example we're going to take a look at is a recent one, involving the meaning of the term racism. Earlier this year, Merriam-Webster announced that they would be altering their definition of racism to include systemic racism. Merriam-Webster's first definition of racism was a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. The decision to expand the definition to cover systemic racism was taken after a campaign by Kennedy Mitchum, a Drake University graduate, who wrote, "Racism is not only prejudice against a certain race due to the color of a person's skin, as it states in your dictionary. It is both prejudice combined with social and institutional power. It is a system of advantage based on skin color." Now, Mitchum's argument is not particularly new. The idea that racism is not simply prejudice based on race, but prejudice plus power, is an idea that has been around for decades. However, the part that's relevant here is that this new definition has moved from hypothetical and exploratory, usually limited to the musings of far-left college professors, and into the mainstream and objective record. The reason such a ground-level change is so impactful is because it intentionally takes a subjective conclusion, which is far from conclusive, and forces it into the next generation's set of objective terms. Now, you and I have grown up understanding the true meaning of racism, which is the fundamental belief that one race is superior to another. It won't matter to us necessarily that the definition has changed. Our lives will go on as normal, and our version of racism will remain the same. But think about the next generation, or in the laughably likely event that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is wrong and the world doesn't end any minute now, the generation after that. These generations will have grown up not believing, like today's radical left, but knowing that racism is prejudice plus power. It may appear that the left are expanding the definition of racism by adding another part to the definition. However, over time, the results will be quite the opposite. By adding power as a defining attribute of racism, they will restrict the range of cases which can be condemned as racist. By changing one single word, they have limited the type of people who can and cannot be racist depending on their race. Remembering the left's false power structure, with white people on the top and everyone else beneath them, then racism being prejudice plus power means that only white people can now be racist, which is certainly music to the ears of open racists like Al Sharpton, Ilhan Omar, or Louis Farrakhan. This strategy of achieving a political goal by changing the meaning of a word or words is used time and time and time again by the left. Think about a recent advert on Twitter by Tampax, the Tampon and Feminine Care Corporation. Their tweet read, "Fact, not all women have periods." Also a fact, not all people with periods are women. Let's celebrate the diversity of all people who bleed. Hashtag mythbusting, hashtag period truths, hashtag trans is beautiful. Now, this insane tweet is the result of years of linguistic pressure from the left over the meaning of the word woman. For those of us who live in biological reality, men and women are different, and in the vast majority of cases, this difference is clear on a chromosomal level. A person can only experience a period if they have a uterus, and only women have a uterus. You don't need to be Aristotle to conclude that given these set of actual facts, only women can have periods. With that obvious truth in mind, let's take another look at that statement. The farcical tweet begins with fact, thereby applying a new definition of the word fact. The lines, "not all women have periods" and "not all people with periods are women" are objectively false, given our definition of men and women, but become true if we accept the false premise that the single definition of woman is suddenly different. By changing the meaning of one word yet again, the left have changed the very reality of sex and gender. The left's platform is full of these sorts of political redefinitions. Unborn babies are bundles of cells because sucking out a bundle of cells into a sink isn't murder. Semi-automatic and automatic firearms are the same and should therefore all be banned. Conservatives are Nazis, meaning that they must be cast out from the arena of debate. The definition of individual words matter, and by allowing their definition to be dictated by the left, we are allowing them to change the rules of the game itself. Now that we've shown that the left have a plan for certain individual words, we should now broaden our focus to look at their wider bag of tricks, which, combined with basic redefinition of words, can be used to further their plans. The most controversial or divisive issues at the heart of our national political debate are deeply complex, at least on a philosophical level. To discuss abortion objectively, we are forced to answer questions such as when does life begin? And when do the rights of one individual supersede the rights of another? To discuss the subject of same-sex marriage, we must first discuss the role of government and whether it should have anything to do with marriage in the first place. To discuss gun rights, we must unpack the various interpretations of the Second Amendment and decide whether such freedoms can apply to .22 caliber handguns or intercontinental missiles. Usually, conservatives love getting into the weeds of these debates. We like details, we like data, we like difficult questions. The left, on the other hand, don't. They like simplicity and subjectivity, preferring to choose emotion over data. The reason for this is that many of their ideas are, to put it bluntly, bad ideas and must achieve success through other means. This is where the second strategy of the abuse of language comes in, through the use of meaningless tautologies and empty slogans to dilute complex issues, with the goal being to elicit support without having to actually perform the logical or factual legwork. Now, the word tautology is a term which describes a statement which is always true. You've got to do what you've got to do is a tautological statement, as are it is what it is and either it is or it isn't. As a result, such statements offer nothing of logical or ideological value. The left routinely uses tautological statements to dilute a complex and diverse debate into what seems obvious and simple to the untrained eye. If you're not careful, you hear a statement which is, by definition, true, and then make the mistake of assuming the premise they are pushing beneath that statement is true. If you fall victim to this trick, you accept a leftist position without actually having to be convinced of any substantive or relevant detail. One such example is the phrase "love is love," a term used by LGBTQ+ activists to validate a range of complex positions, such as same-sex marriage or adoption by same-sex couples. The point here is not to argue that same-sex marriage or adoption by same-sex couples, for example, is wrong. There are valid and ideologically consistent arguments on both sides of this debate. The point is that the use of an empty and meaningless phrase like "love is love" is often used to avoid this debate entirely by painting anyone who disagrees as someone rejecting the irrefutable tautology used as a shield. If you disagree, for example, that churches shouldn't be forced by the federal government to perform same-sex weddings, or that religious bakers in Colorado should be forced to bake same-sex wedding cakes, you're disagreeing that love is love. Since love is true and always true, you are illogically forced to accept all the ideological baggage it carries if you're not careful. Then there is the tactic of using empty slogans to dilute the debate itself, with the same conclusion that disagreement on a complex issue is the same as disagreeing with the empty slogan itself. Take the term "science is real," which Democrats have used repeatedly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Their goal is to paint themselves as the only side that believes in science, where science means whatever they want it to mean, as we've already discussed. This means that the other side, in other words, conservatives, don't believe that science is real, and therefore all of their positions, which are in any way science-related, are also false. Again, this allows the left to avoid nuance and data and complexity. Our positions decrying the broad levels of government overreach regarding lockdowns or mask mandates, for example, can't be taken seriously because they mean that we don't believe science is real. And we can't point out that the left's solution to climate change is precisely the same set of policies they've wanted for 50 years, because that also means we don't believe in science. Notice the pattern. Take a complex debate and come up with a tautological statement or catchy slogan to represent that debate. Then present any counterarguments to any part of that complex debate as a counterargument to its representation. Let's look at 3 examples you will almost certainly have seen yourself. Firstly, Black Lives Matter. The objective statement that Black Lives Matter is obviously true, in the same way that white lives matter, blue lives matter, men's lives matter, women's lives matter. However, if you point out, for example, that the Black Lives Matter movement is an openly Marxist organization which is advocating for the destruction of fundamental American principles, you are therefore disagreeing suddenly that Black lives' lives have any value. Secondly, believe all women. The words in this now infamous phrase were carefully selected. Setting aside the issue we discussed earlier regarding the sporadic meaning of the word woman, let's look at the word believe. Why did they choose believe? Early on during the Me Too movement, advocates would say that we should take the accusations of women seriously, a position I imagine all of you, wholeheartedly agree with. Accusations of sexual harassment or sexual assault should always be taken seriously and should always be investigated. I really don't think that's up for debate. Then why wasn't the phrase take women seriously or listen to women or something similar? The answer is because there was a deeper goal, which was to use this catchy and illogical phrase as a political cheat code by implying that truthfulness is guaranteed by gender. The phrase believe all women argues that all women are truthful and should therefore be believed regardless of evidence or lack thereof. With this foundation, the spurious accusations against Brett Kavanaugh became undeniably true simply because they were made by women. The left doesn't choose the word believe because they necessarily care about sexual assault. Hillary Clinton, after all, stands as a counterexample to both the idea that women never lie and that Democrats take accusations of sexual assault particularly seriously. They chose the word believe because it helped them achieve their political objective, allowing them to reject dissent as evidence that you don't care about rape. Lastly, think of the common chant, protect children, not guns. This is an example of another logical trick used by the left, known as a false binary. The claim begins with protect children. So far, so good. I'm fairly sure we can all agree that we should protect children. However, the important part is not guns, specifically the word not. This makes the false implication that there are some who choose to protect guns instead of choosing to protect children. In other words, there are only two mutually exclusive choices available to us. We can either pick to protect children or protect guns. While this is obviously untrue, if you make the mistake of accepting the premise of this binary, you are immediately mischaracterized as someone who values guns over the lives of children, an accusation leveled against gun right advocates on a daily basis, and I'm sure one that many of you have experienced too. There is a reason the left rely on slogans like Black Lives Matter, believe all women, protect children, not guns, or tautologies like love is love. Our debates should be complicated, with room for nuance, compromise, and factual information. If we play by the rules of facts and logic, the left know they're going to lose. Therefore, when you notice the use of a bumper sticker catchphrase, remember that it's not being used to help the debate, it's being used to actively avoid it entirely. As an ironic side note, notice how many of the left's favorite virtue signaling slogans are both used in a way to be self-contradictory and also divisive. If you drive around any Democrat-heavy suburb, you will see yard sign after yard sign offering proof that those inside are on the right side of history, the good guys, the Democrats. These same slogans are repeated by Democrats on the campaign trail, such as Biden offering this collection of slurred thoughts. We choose hope over fear, unity over division, science over fiction, and yes, truth over lies. Now, sounds kind of good, but can you see how divisive this language actually is? Biden says that we choose unity over division, meaning that the opposite of we, i.e. them, don't choose unity. He's dividing people over whether they choose his version of unity, which is itself divisive. The notion of democratic hypocrisy shouldn't really surprise any of you, of course. The Democrats who call for hope over fear are constantly fueling terror in their ranks that voting for Trump is tantamount to a death sentence. The Democrats who call for unity over division see anyone who refuses to unite with them as a deplorable human being who endorses white supremacy. The Democrats who call for science over fiction support abortion to the point of birth, and the Democrats who call for truth over lies also claim that Biden never opposed fracking. During the speech, I've given you examples of the left's abuse of language. They change the basic redefinition of single words like women or racism, and they carefully curate and collect certain words as catchy slogans to drive their agenda forward. Despite understanding this, some of you may see these tactics and now ask, so what? The answer to that is actually simple. If you care about conservatism, or even the traditional Western liberalism which has allowed our civilization to expand and flourish, then you should want to protect these values. The truth is that these values are being undermined and even erased by a long-term strategy of revisionism through language. If you don't want radical leftism to become the mainstream and eventually only position of our politics and culture, then you can't simply shrug when they inject their desired political conclusions into our language. If you're not careful, you may find yourself promoting their propaganda with your own speech, whether you like it or not. As Ronald Reagan famously said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. The concept of freedom is complex, but an important part of freedom is our ability to think what we want and then say what we think. Remember that quote from 1984 I read you at the start. Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. Every time we abandon the field of battle when it comes to a word or a phrase, the left narrow our society's range of thought by hijacking the tools we use to express opinions and ideas, making their political victory more likely. If we accept the new definition of racism, we effectively endorse racism by those who aren't white and/or racism against those who are white. If we accept the new definition of woman, we erase the massive strides made by the feminist movement in the fight for true gender equality. If we accept the use of lazy phrases to avoid debate, we endorse abortion on demand, because after all, it's a human right and they're only bundles of cells. We endorse false allegations of sexual assault, because after all, we must believe all women. And we endorse the destruction of religious liberty, because after all, love is love. Now, the obvious question remains, how can I fight back? And there are 3 principles which we, regardless of political affiliation, should remember if we wish to sabotage the left's war on our language. I want to leave you with these 3 principles. The first is, don't fall for it. Their strategies include tricks of language and tricks of logic. Before being caught in their trap, practice taking a moment, setting emotion aside, and analyzing the structure of their argument. Find the argument beneath the argument, the root of the debate itself, before engaging, and you will have a better chance of evading their tools of distraction and deflection. The second is, don't be afraid to focus on the details. All of these tricks of language we have discussed have a common theme. They avoid detail, they avoid complexity, and they avoid nuance. Embrace these details and force them to the forefront of the debate. The devil is always in the details, and it's a devil we unleash on our society if we allow the details to be ignored. The third and final principle is to speak the truth. In our society, this is often the hardest to achieve, as it will inevitably lead to some level of rejection when we consider the topics dividing us today. Don't be afraid to speak the truth about the nature of sex and gender. Don't be afraid to speak the truth about the reality of abortion. Don't be afraid to focus on the facts of gun control, race relations, or healthcare. Ultimately, our ongoing battle for our politics and culture come down to the very meaning of what is true and what is false. As we've discussed, words are the tools we use to describe the truth of our current reality and explore the future we want to pursue and elements of our past we want to protect. The goal of many on the left is to change the truth of our past, our present, and therefore our future by changing or restricting our ability to explore these ideas. Don't let them. In order to seek the truth, we must speak the truth. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start reading off the Q&A. If anybody else has any more questions, please send them in and I will read them off. So starting off, we have a question from Zach saying, having friends from Germany, they stand firm on the support of their government to ban expressions such as the swastika. With something as emotional as that, it is hard to explain to them the general repercussions of banning expression, even some as horrid as that. What is the best way to approach a shutdown topic like this?
Well, I think it's always going to be tricky speaking to anyone from Germany regarding the issue of the swastika. I think a lot of modern day Germans make extraordinary efforts to recognize the horrors of their modern history. And so you've got to take that context in mind. But I think the position I always take is that any issues like this involving freedom always hit a line where the answer gets quite difficult, honestly. It's like freedom of speech issues. What about when people say things that are objectively terrible or hurt your feelings? Like the result of something bad from any form of freedom is something you should almost expect. That shouldn't be a reason to shut that conversation down. So I would advise them just to take that debate with that open mind, that context, and understand that there is always going to be a bad side. Like, for example, people talking about banning Holocaust denial. Like that is like an extreme edge of freedom of speech, which if you truly believe in freedom of speech, you should arguably be in favor of allowing people to express those views, even if you think they're abhorrent.
Okay, and then moving on to our next question, we have a question from Brooke saying, how do you debate against a bumper sticker slogan? So I'm assuming they are referring to something like coexist, something like that.
I think I would just say it for what it is. Like, why are you placing an entire complex debate behind a bumper sticker? Like if someone, all they have is to scream a bumper sticker in your face, it's quite clear that they don't really have a lot sort of beneath that argument. So I would start to pick it apart. It's like, well, what does coexist mean? It's like, ask them what it means, force them to justify it. Don't let them use, as I said in the speech, don't let them use these slogans as a way to actually escape the details.
Okay, and then those are the two questions I have. Does anybody else have any more questions? Oh wait, nope, somebody just typed one. Okay, cool. So this is anonymous. It says, can people be trusted to handle an unlimited range of information and ideas without any government intervention? Any thoughts on this?
I think that's a kind of scary question, like the idea of can you trust people with information? I think any answer other than yes is really bordering on authoritarianism, in that the government has some role in controlling the information you have access to. I think that's a very slippery slope where you could then enter cases where the government think you don't deserve to know certain things because it'll keep you safer. You don't deserve to know certain truths because it might open your door to views they find wrong. And so any sort of idea of that, I think, should terrify anyone, honestly.
Okay, and then our next question is from Hugo saying, what is your opinion on the LGBT plus community?
I mean, I think that's somewhat, I'm going to push back on the question, and I don't really have an opinion on any community. That's like asking me, what do I think about Black people or white people or Jews? I don't have an opinion about a community in terms of a label assigned to people. I think it's something I actually think is wrong with America, is the way we obsessively look at people by some immutable characteristic that doesn't really have anything to do with their character. So in some ways, I think I'm just going to push back on the premise of the question. I think if people want to ask me about what I think about, say, the movements driving certain aspects, I think I'd be happy to talk about that. But I think it's quite dangerous to think what do you think of a community?
Okay, and our next question, this is another one from an anonymous, saying, loved your original points about the quick catch phrases that shut off conversation. It's very true. However, I was wondering why you used love is love as one of those quick points, as gay rights isn't necessarily a conservative issue.
So I think I used it because it's a tautology, right? It's a meaningless statement. Saying love is like saying up is up or red is red. It doesn't mean anything, but a lot of people use the phrase love is love to justify a lot of the conclusions they have regarding various LGBTQ issues. And so, for example, love is love. Therefore, of course, same-sex marriage should be permitted. Of course, churches should be forced to allow same-sex marriages in their churches. I think it's included because it's important to realize that while it sounds great, it's actually a meaningless statement, and it should be acknowledged for being meaningless.
Okay, and I think we have another question, the chapter president, Emily, who's going to ask it herself.
So do you think the social justice warrior movement is actually regressing us in issues like racial issues and stuff like that?
Yes, absolutely. I think part of that regression is on purpose, and I think part of it is by accident. I think there are a lot of people out there who see issues like race as a very reliable political football, which is why you see Democrats every single election period coming out and going after certain racial groups. I mean, Joe Biden released an advert today where he was talking specifically to Black people, as if Black people are uniquely different to white people in terms of what they want in their lives, what is going on in their character, what is in their soul. The way people divide people up by, again, immutable characteristics, I think is a really bad part of our society that social justice fuels, because it's easy. It's very easy to look at someone and say, oh, they're different because they wear different clothes to me, or they have a different belief about God than me, or they eat different foods than me. It's a very, very primitive way of dividing people, but ultimately humans are still quite primitive. It's very easy to divide us by tribes. And so I think they realize that it's a reliable political football, and if you can divide people into tribes that they'll vote for you over the other person, then why not do it?
Okay, and then I have another question from the Q&A section. Again, if you guys have a question, please type it in the Q&A. This is another one from an anonymous attendee. Where do you draw the line between speech that outwardly expresses violence and speech that possibly incites violence? What should be the determining factor in government oh wait, no, that's two different questions, sorry. Okay, so the first one was, where do you draw the line between speech that outwardly expresses violence and speech that possibly incites violence?
So I think we have to be I think it's kind of answered somewhat in the question of we have to be very, very careful where we draw this line. I think we have to settle on something that is an objective, direct call for violence. So like a tweet saying, meet me at this time tonight to go and burn this house down, I think would obviously be a direct incitement of violence. But for example, when Trump said something like, when the, I can't remember what the phrase was, but he basically says, when something else happens, the bullets start flying. Was accused of being an incitement of violence. I don't see that as a direct incitement of violence. You can talk about violence, you can talk about the possibility of violence occurring, but unless your precise language is calling for specific and targeted violence, I think that's where we should draw the line. It's obviously difficult to do, and it's hard to answer in a very short space of time because there's always going to be these very, very blurred areas. But I think we need to be as specific as possible when it comes to the direction that incitement of violence is being pointed towards.
Okay, and then this question is from the same person saying, what should the determining factor in government regulation concerning this ambiguity? Which that might have actually been referring to the last question, but they typed in two different questions. So,
sorry, could you mind repeating that?
Yeah, so what should be the determining factor in government regulation concerning this ambiguity?
So I guess by determining factor, I assume they mean like, how should they decide whether or not something breaks this rule? Again, I think it fits the specific targeted call for violence. And so the problem is as well, it has to be a bipartisan thing. So I think we almost have to have a set of phrases that we use as a template, unfortunately, because most of this is pretty partisan. I mean, the language of the left and the language of the right throughout elections is routinely violent in nature. Like we talk about fighting war. I use the word war multiple times in my speech. Some could say that is an incitement of violence. So I think we just need to be making sure that, one, it's targeted towards a specific group of people or a specific person. And two, it has a direct instruction for specific violence against that person. So we can't be, I'm going to fight a war with this person. It has to be, I'm going to physically fight this person at this place for this reason.
Okay, and then we can do a couple more questions. So the next one would be, should private sectors be allowed to regulate speech? I'm especially curious what you think about certain sectors that get some government funding, even if minimal, such as certain private schools.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting question. I think I would always fall on the idea that if you're receiving any money from the government, then some strings have to come with that. If you decide you want to enact your private right as a private citizen to not allow certain speech within your organization, I don't think you should be taking public money from anyone. For exactly the same reason, it's the same logic as I don't want to give money to an organization that provides people with abortions. I know speech and abortions are quite extreme, different things, but ultimately it's the same logic where if you are receiving money from the public, then you have to adhere by a public level set of rules. And so I would say that basically if you're accepting money from the state, you have to basically act as a state entity when it comes to things like the First Amendment.
Okay, and then the next one would be, how do you have a discussion against someone that thinks you are racist if you don't agree with the slogan Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, so that's the tricky part. I think you've got to, whenever you're deciding who to talk with, you've got to be like very careful very early on to decide whether it's worth your time. So I'm not saying this is just to cross your arms, sit down and cover your ears and refuse to engage with anyone. But there are some people, especially on Twitter, for example, they don't actually want to engage. They just want to call you a racist and walk away feeling good about themselves. So first you need to determine whether or not they think you're racist to shut you up or because they actually think your viewpoint is racist. Once you determine that they actually care about your view and that they don't necessarily want to believe you're racist, then it's a matter of asking them why they think you're racist, because ultimately a lot of conservative views are by definition not racist. We look at individuals. We don't care about skin color. It's the left that talk endlessly about skin color and religion and all other types of minority labels that really don't matter in the eye of a true conservative. So once you force them to actually, again, get into the details of their accusation, most often you actually allow them to pull their own argument apart just by pointing out the obvious issues with their assumptions.
Okay, and the next question, again from an anonymous attendee, saying, what is your opinion on the idea of implicit bias? I came into college not believing this, but as I go through my cognitive science / pre-med coursework, science seems to suggest that it exists. What do you think?
So I think I'd push back on like science saying that it suggests that it exists. I haven't really seen actual evidence of this. I think the few studies that have shown things like implicit bias and unconscious bias don't really stand up to any real scientific proof that I've seen. Like if anyone has seen something different, I'd be more than happy to read it. But I had two problems with this. One, there's no real science to back it up. I think I would push back there. But also, if something is subconscious and unconscious, then it's kind of impossible to do anything about to some extent. I think often this is done. People say, well, you're not consciously biased, but you're unconsciously biased. Therefore, the cure to this disease that we cannot see and we cannot diagnose is for you to follow every single one of our rules. So I think it's actually a way of getting people to behave as you want them to behave without actually having to give a reason. Like, by nature of your skin color, you are a victim or you are an oppressor. And that is just a part of your subconscious that you can't possibly change. So therefore, you have to adhere to my rules. I think it's pretty dangerous. And I think anything you can't prove doesn't really have any real means to deserve to be part of a debate, honestly.
Okay, and then we have 3 more questions, and then we can go from there. So the next one is from Morgan, saying, what is your #1 tip for students that are targeted for being conservative?
Yeah, so this is actually interesting. So I went to university in England, and so I have a completely different college experience to all of you. Like, my college experience wasn't particularly political. If you wanted to do political things, you could find it, but it wasn't shoved in your face in the same way. So my advice would actually be to pick your moments. So for example, I've heard a lot of American students have to deal with far left professors who would give them bad grades if they wrote something that wasn't in line with some radical Marxist doctrine. I would say and do what you need to do to pass the class, and then do what you want once you've passed. It's kind of, it's hard as an individual because you've got to pick this line between doing what is right for you and what you believe, but also not screwing yourself over in the process. Like, it would be great if every college student could just stand up and walk out of a class, but then they wouldn't end up getting their degree, and that might affect them in the future. So in terms of in the classroom, be careful, pick your moments, and do what you need to do to try and find that line that works best for you. In the outside world, I think if you want to engage politically with other students, I think that's very important to do. I think part of the reason the left is so dominant in college campuses is because a lot of people on the right don't speak up. But I think there are far more people who are conservative in some way than people like to give credit for. And so if you feel comfortable being that person to speak up, I think it's very empowering. And something I've done in the past is I've been the first person to speak up, and then lots of people come to me afterward and say, like, I'm glad you said something. I wish I could. Again, I'm not saying that you necessarily should. This has to be a personal decision, but you just need to find that balance of what is right for you, and so you can look yourself in the mirror. I think you don't want to go through life biting your tongue and then watching everything burn around you as bad ideas flourish.
Okay, and then our next one is going to be from Gabriel, our chapter's campus coordinator, and he'll ask it himself.
So first of all, how long have you been in the writing and commentary field? And with that being said, what event made you realize how strong these words and phrases that the left are using?
Yeah, so I've been, I'd say, politically active since the summer of 2018. It was really the Kavanaugh hearings that drove me to start doing something. I was surrounded by people who were nodding along to all of the nonsense that was online about Kavanaugh obviously being a rapist, and oh, I was raped, therefore Kavanaugh is guilty, all these kind of things. I was surrounded by what I thought were very smart people who were just swallowing this propaganda gleefully. And so I realized that if I wanted things to change, then I should be willing to say what I think. In terms of the moment that made me realize this use of words, I think it's been more of a drip process. I think Believe All Women was the first instance where I looked and I thought, like, oh, this is logically absurd. I think this really made me realize that it's a very deliberate choice of words. And then Black Lives Matter, I think, is a more obvious one that's more recent. But I think Believe All Women is so laughably untrue. Like, it doesn't hold any water, and yet it was the basis for an entire movement and almost destroyed a man's career, certainly destroyed his reputation, and did damage to the general view of a lot of men, honestly. Like, during that time, it wasn't a fun time to be male. I think a lot of people felt like their view didn't matter simply because they were male. So it's certainly a very impactful phrase that really sparked that in my head.
Okay, and we are continuing to get questions. So if you want to keep going, we can keep going.
Great. Yeah, happy to keep going.
Okay, then we have another one from Tim saying, often discourse is emotional, so the logical is not accessible. To my radicalized friends on the left, so is there no way to move forward with civil discourse when facts are neither important nor trusted?
I think it's difficult, but you can actually use the emotion to your advantage, because I think this is something conservatives don't do very well. Like, I think we're so obsessed with I'm factually right, like almost the opposite of AOC, right? I'm factually right, therefore it doesn't really matter if I'm morally right or not. And then there's a balance, because if you're factually right, the morals we value build on that naturally. And so I think when we're talking about various issues, say racism or gun violence, we can bring emotion into it. Like, for example, you can advocate for gun rights because you care about the ability of people to defend themselves. You care about people who don't have private security right outside their door. You care about people who live in terrible neighborhoods who are at risk of being robbed any second. And so you can use emotion to your advantage. You've just got to be careful that you don't fall into the very easy trap of using emotion to replace evidence. I think you can use both at the same time, no problem.
And our next one is from anonymous attendee. Not concerning legality, do you believe that people like Kaepernick seem justified in their opinion of kneeling for the flag? I know that RBG called him an idiot, but what's your take on it?
Yeah, so I think it's something that I didn't like at all. I think it's disrespectful. I think the national anthem is something that can bring everyone together before a sports game. I think it's a wonderful sign of unity. And to deliberately kneel and do something to take that, I think is pretty awful. But it's perfect right to do it. I think it's a First Amendment right to really do what you want in that sense. But two people can be right at once, right? He can be justified in doing so in his mind for his reasons. And I think it's a disgusting thing to do. I think the problem is everyone saw it as if he is able to do it, that makes it right. And if he isn't right to do it, that makes it wrong. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. So it certainly shouldn't be illegal. But if people don't want to buy his jersey, and if he doesn't want to play in the NFL again because he's actually a hilariously mediocre quarterback who is now more famous as an activist as a player, I mean, you're in Michigan, like football's a big deal there. Everyone knows Kaepernick is awful, just awful. And so the way the left have used sports to push their activism with a failed player, I think is quite funny, honestly. I don't really care about his kneeling. I think it's more says something about the national anthem and how we show respect to people who do far more for the country than I could ever do personally. You know, I haven't served in the military. I think it's amazing people do. And so to respect the flag that means so much to other people, I think is an important thing.
Okay, and then this next one is actually a really good question. It's saying, how do you feel about the constant lies by the media? Obviously, their speech, even if riddled with lies, can't be banned or restricted. It is obviously difficult to get your voice out with these news giants hovering over us. How do we go about spreading the truth?
So this is a very good question, right? Because unless it's like deliberate slander, where you are deliberately making up stories about someone to ruin their reputation, knowing that it's false, the media are very careful with the stories they push. Quite like they use words like allegedly, supposedly, things like that, just to cover themselves. So in terms of taking them to court, usually you don't have much option. A lot of this is on us as consumers. Like the mainstream media are only a big deal because they have viewership. Their viewership is plummeting because of organizations like the Daily Wire, who I work for. Like people are going to these other sources that, yes, they have a bias, but it's an open bias. And so a lot of this is on us just to go somewhere else. Like if you don't like the product, go somewhere else. And they're going to kick and stream as their industry dies, but they have a choice to make. Either they want their viewership to go up, in which case they're going to have to stop lying to us like idiots, or they're just going to have to accept their fate. But it's going to be a very slow death is the only problem. I think we're in that like dying phase where we're kind of slowly watching them collapse. I mean, like CNN's numbers are hilariously bad, but we're watching that very, very, very slow decline that feels horribly painful to be in the moment. But if we zoom out, it's really not that long in terms of how long the mainstream media as a powerhouse has been around. The internet is cracking a lot of their shields a little bit, which is why they're pushing so hard on things like the social media aspect, the internet control aspect. But go somewhere else, get your information elsewhere, and then like enjoy their demise, I think is what I'm certainly doing.
Well, I agree with you there. The next question is from Tim saying, what do you think of rebranding of conservative and social justice warrior? Each term has both positive and negative connotations. How would you address it? How would you address addressing terms with double branding?
Yeah, so I think It's hard because we need labels to exist in a society. Like you need some way of summarizing your set of views. Like you could have two conservatives and I'm sure they would disagree on something. I think we need to get better at accepting slightly more specific language than on the left or on the right. Like I'm guilty of this too. I use the word on the left all the time, but that's a very broad range of people. Same with people on the right. So that kind of covers my answer regarding the use of the word conservative or liberal or leftist to cover someone. Someone like a social justice warrior, though, I think is actually an appropriate term because social justice itself is a meaningless phrase. Like there is no such thing as social justice. And so it encompasses all elements of nonsense underneath that term. So there are some of these overbroad terms that I think make sense. And there are others which I agree completely. Something like conservative should be more specific. For example, there are never Trumper conservatives and there are pro-Trump conservatives who really agree on very little, but they're viewed as conservative from outside. So I think something we can do better as ourselves, like when you describe yourself, your set of views, do more than just say, oh yeah, I'm a conservative.
Okay, and this next one is actually, again, another really good question. It's saying, how do you handle this argument? This speech isn't protected because you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. If you support free speech, would you have to concede that something like this should be protected as no violence is incited? Or do you consider fear and panic to be violence as they can cause emotional trauma in some people? If so, what repercussions would this have to our current idea about free speech?
Yeah, so I actually want to push back a little bit on the shouting fire in a crowded theater. I don't actually know if that comes under the First Amendment or not. I need to do my research on that. I know it's slightly contentious at least. I know Joe Biden likes to use that example, but I know a lot of conservatives like Ben Shapiro's push back on that. So I need to do a little more reading on that one. But in terms of if emotion are involved, emotion is not a physical thing. And so again, like talking about protecting speech and inciting violence earlier, it has to be physical. Like your hurt feelings aren't physical. And so fear is also an emotion. Panic is emotion, really. And so, yes, violent things can come from that fear, can come from that panic, but that's not justification to control speech. Like the fact that some people do things out of fear is meaningless. Like people do things out of all kinds of reasons, all kinds of emotions. You can do things out of love, you can do things out of hate. That doesn't mean you get to legislate the language surrounding that emotion because the outcome could be physical.
Okay, and now we have two more. The first being, how do you join the political world as a conservative?
So I guess I'd like to know what they mean by like join the political world. So I think I'll guess at what they mean. So in terms of just being outwardly conservative, I think it's something you need to choose when and where you do it. Because obviously you can cause issues. Like if you're at a company, for example, that's very left-leaning or very right-leaning and you come out with open politics, it might cause an issue. It might cause an issue with your social groups. You need to decide whether or not it's worth it. In terms of doing what I'm doing, which is like trying to become a political commentator, things like that, a lot of that is just starting. I think like Jeremy Boring speaks about this quite often. And like the first step of doing anything is starting to do it. And I think that's the best advice I can give anyone is it's very easy to kind of sit there, think about doing something and almost get the small sense of gratification just from the thought of doing it. But the true gratification comes from doing it and trying it out. You may fail, you may succeed, but the first step is actually doing it. So what do I mean by doing it in this case? It means writing for your own blog. Like the joy of the internet is there are no gatekeepers to this anymore. If you wanted to be a political commentator, say 20, 30 years ago, it was almost impossible to break into that field. Now anyone can do it. You need a Twitter account, you need an Instagram account, you need a blog. That's it. So you can get started, start collecting your thoughts, and also just read a lot. I think there are some people out there who, I say this is a problem with like the MAGA crowd area of conservatism to some extent, where they think that being a commentator is just like putting on a hat and holding up a sign. I think you need to do conservatism more justice sometimes and really dig into things. There are still things I'm learning. Like I know far less than I am yet to know, hopefully. And so be humble about what you know and have a curiosity about conservatism. I think that's the best way to get into it, is to keep digging and keep learning. Don't fall into the trap of being like the bumper sticker conservative like the left are. Like really know your stuff. And then from there, I think your experience will be longer lasting too.
Okay, that was a great answer. And then this is our last question.
Okay, great.
So from going to college in London, did you gain a different viewpoint of America that Europeans or foreigners see?
What, sorry?
So the question is, from going to college in London, did you gain a different viewpoint of America that Europeans or foreigners see? I think they're asking, do you have a different viewpoint of America that Americans don't really have that
Oh,
is
I
kind
see.
of commonplace in like Europe?
Yeah, so I actually went to university in Oxford, so I met a lot of Americans there. There's a lot of like American students come over for years abroad, things like that. So I met a lot of Americans there. So I would say I get a slightly better exposure to like what is America and who are Americans. Most English people don't know a thing about America. Most English people learn what they know about America from satirical news shows in England who just poke fun at Americans because British people are, I hate to say it, like quite often arrogant on the world stage. And so they look down on Americans as quite frankly idiots, which I think is appalling, but that's truly how a lot of Europeans think. They look at Americans and just see idiots. You see movies like Borat that profit off this idea of people literally going to the cinema to watch a multi-millionaire go around and humiliate polite middle-class Americans. So I think that there's definitely a problem in Europe generally, not just on the college level, on every level, where people don't know many Americans, they don't know what they stand for, they don't know how kind and thoughtful and supportive and positive they are. And so they like to laugh at the stereotypes to some extent in the same way that we laugh at the stereotypes of Europeans. But there's definitely a problem where people don't see America as a positive entity in the world, except of course until the Germans invade and then suddenly America's the greatest place of all time and you're just like asking them to come over as soon as possible. But when things are going well, people like to kind of look down their nose a bit at America, which is something that I find very disappointing. Like I love living here. I'm deeply proud of living here. I hope to live here a lot longer. So it's disappointing for me and it's a definite problem. It's one that's hard to solve though, right? Without people meeting Americans, without coming to America and learning for themselves.
Thank you. So that's going to be our last question. If you have any more questions, I'm sure you can find him on Instagram at Ian G. Haworth. And if you're interested in joining Turning Point USA at Eastern Michigan University, you can find us on Instagram or email me at emunk@emich.edu. Everybody have a great day and thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.